Welcome to today's event, Europe Profile and Trends. Today's event is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. If you do not consent to being part of a recorded session, please disconnect your line at this time. The recording will be available at the same location you used to join today's event. To learn more about the ways you can participate in today's event, please click on the Messages button in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Feel free to let us know if you are ready to get started by typing in a message and selecting Send. We encourage you to interact by using the Messages panel at any time to ask questions regarding content or to request support. We will do our best to answer all your questions, but due to time constraints, we might not be able to answer all of them during the live event. Your feedback is important. Please take a few minutes to complete a survey that will appear at the end of the event. Thank you in advance for your support. If you experience any technical difficulties, refresh your browser by pressing Ctrl F5 or the Refresh Now button on the information panel. If this does not resolve the issue, please send in a message and we will be happy to assist. There is also an online test page if you wish to self-support. Simply click the Help button in the Information tab. And now I'd like to introduce your host and first presenter, Catherine Devine, Global Business Strategy Leader, Libraries and Museums, Microsoft. Catherine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Heather, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have a truly international audience today, and we also have a truly international speaker lineup while we discuss geographical things. This is the Inspiring the Digital Landscape in Libraries and Museums webinar series. This is the third in that series. My name is Catherine Devine, and I'm based in Seattle. I am responsible for looking at libraries and museums globally. What are the needs of libraries and museums? And I think many of you have probably already got to know me over the last year or so. Today we have a great agenda. We're going to be talking about what is happening in Europe. In our series, we have been alternating between talking about parts of the digital transformation framework for libraries and museums and the 4 pillars of that, talking about the impact of COVID, because there's no way we can't talk about COVID these days. And then looking at geographical regions and talk a little bit more about why we're doing that in a minute. But before we do that, let me first talk about the great speakers that we have today. So today we have two fabulous speakers. We have Steven Wyber. Steven is from the International Federation of Libraries Association. He's based in The Hague in the Netherlands, although I believe he is British. And Steven and I had the pleasure of meeting last year in London and really had a great conversation, and so impressed by this organization and what they're doing and their understanding, obviously, because that's their goal in life, of understanding of the library space and the larger sort of meta issues in libraries. So I'm really thrilled to have Steven join us today. And then we're going to follow up with Mark East. So Mark is my colleague here at Microsoft. Just to remind everybody, because sometimes it's not clear, Libraries and Museums rolls up to the larger education organization in Microsoft. Mark is the Senior Director for Education in Europe, Middle East, Africa, what we call EMEA. And he's actually based in Dubai, although he's also British. Mark is, as I said, my colleague. He looks at schools, universities, libraries, and museums throughout the EMEA region, and really has an amazing. My colleague. Oops. And really has an amazing. The EMEA region. Really has an amazing sort of background at Microsoft. He's been at Microsoft for 32 years now, I believe, and has been in education most, if not all, of that time. Really has an amazing legacy, both the evolution of technology and the evolution of education, and really an amazing colleague. So I'm really looking forward to talking to him. Today's agenda, we're going to sort of have 3 topics here and then Q&A. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the key observations in Europe, and then we're going to go into Steven and then Mark. Stephen will obviously talk about libraries. Mark will talk about the larger education and museums. And then we'll go into Q&A. But first, let me talk about, what was the inspiration here. So in my role, I've been incredibly lucky here at Microsoft to really have a role that looks globally. And one of the most fascinating things about that is that, it causes you to, as I say, change multiple cultures in a day. So particularly under COVID, where, we're all sort of working remotely still. But even when I was traveling in this role, you're always in a different country. So under a COVID world, I probably have 10 meetings in a day, and I probably change countries 10 times in a day. And every meeting, you're like switching roles. You're like, what is the culture of this country? What is the language of this country? It's given me great exposure, and I really wanted to bring some of that to these webinar series. I think it's great that we learn from other geographical regions, that we understand what is happening in Europe in this particular case, because we're not necessarily exposed to it every day. And of course, if you are in Europe, you are, and hopefully you'll enjoy our subsequent series. So we're going to be looking, in December, we're going to be looking at the Middle East, which is a fascinating area when it comes to museums and libraries. We're going to be looking at Asia, we're going to be looking at South America. But really the goal here is to learn from other regions and, I really want to look at the strengths. I think we're living in a world that really needs some good news and some positivity. And so I'm going to try and bring some positivity to that. What are the strengths of each region? And how does that help us in other regions learn? And of course, if you're in that region, then appreciate the strength that you have. So with that, I'm going to talk about 3 today, just as a sort of setup to our conversation here, and then we'll dive deeper on some of these in our conversations with Stephen and Mark. So the very first one that I really notice is the significance of culture in European society. So that may sound, well, yes, of course, right? We have amazing, ancient history civilizations such as, Greece and, even studying, I realize that Egypt is not Europe, but, geographically we're getting close. Italy has an amazing history. United Kingdom, France, Germany all have amazing histories that go back centuries and longer, right? Millennia. And then we get into places like Scandinavia, which have, maybe more of a recent view. Well, actually, Scandinavia, they all have long histories as well. But when you compare it to places like, say, United States or even Australia, where I'm from, the length of history is not as long in terms of European civilizations. Clearly, indigenous civilizations have been here much longer. But in terms of that, there isn't that. And so this significance of culture really, I notice, has a big impact. So I want to give you an example of how we sort of see this manifest. So the conversations become different. In Italy during COVID, everybody was, well, actually throughout the world during COVID, everyone was worried about remote work. How they were thinking about, in education, they were worried about remote education. In museums and libraries, they were like, how can we continue to serve our community? And in museums, it was like they had to shut their doors because they were very physical buildings. And everyone's like, how do we do remote work? In Italy, the conversation was completely different. In Italy, the conversation was, how do we make sure that museums continue to have outreach to schools? How can we make sure that our children in Italy don't lose the access to culture? And that was a priority. And, that's what I mean by, I sort of see that as a different conversation to what we're having in other parts of the world. So that's just an example. And I think that this means that, clearly there are also more museums and libraries in Europe than we see elsewhere. But we're going to get into a little bit of that with Stephen. But it's really interesting, I think, that culture is so much part of society, and that drives the experience, and it becomes a much more educational experience. Whereas maybe in other parts of the world, it is not so much that it's not educational. Educational is always a large piece of libraries and museums, but it's sort of an interesting sort of comparison. So the next one is government funding. This is a really obvious one. There are parts of the world where governments very much support arts and culture. And there are parts of the world where that is not true. Europe is a part of the world where, generally speaking, but not always, generally speaking, there's significant investment from governments in supporting the institutions and the place of culture in the country. When that happens, the conversation becomes different as well. So what we see is, because there are these national sort of semi-government organizations and government funding, that this drives collaboration at a country level. So we see in countries like the UK that there are a lot of national initiatives. So some examples of national initiatives that we see is, I'm sure many of you may be familiar with this, is the One by One project, which is being run out of the University of Leicester, but through a government grant. And the One by One project is about addressing the issue of digital literacy in museums. And how can we help museums better understand digital literacy? And when I say digital literacy, what I mean is what I've said in previous webinars, is this idea that people are not necessarily coding or necessarily knowing how to use tools, although that's very important, but actually understanding how technology can help further the missions of the organization, and understanding the role that technology can play. And so we saw coming out of COVID that the difference in organizations that were more literate in digital and understanding the role that digital could play versus ones that weren't, and their ability to be agile and resilient in the face of this. So the One by One project, which is involving lots of major institutions in the United Kingdom. There are also initiatives in United Kingdom around national collections, this idea of digitizing and getting together the collections of the country. In natural history museums, there's this idea of being able to, get the genomic sequence of every animal in the United Kingdom. Those kinds of initiatives we see, and we don't see these in other parts of the world quite so much. There are parts of China where we do start to see things like that, but generally not as much. So this drives both collaboration, which I think collaboration is a key to, how we elevate the sector, how we can elevate solutions, how we can elevate the conversation, how we can address issues around this. And then the final one is this propensity for digital innovation beyond the visitor experience. So I'm going to go to the next slide quickly. You've heard me talk about a digital transformation framework for libraries and museums. And in this, what we have is that we have other webinars here if you wish to find out more about it. I'm not going to go into this here, but we have this idea of 4 pillars and 16 sort of initiatives. One of those is around the connected experience, which is really the visitor experience. And that's where, in some parts of the world, 99% of the conversation happens, right? People want to talk about how to create an exhibition and the experience for an exhibition, or they want to talk in libraries around how to do mixed reality or virtual reality in libraries. These are all important things, but it can't be the whole of the conversation. And this is what we find in Europe. I'm going to go back. That the conversation is much broader than that visitor experience conversation, much broader. So here we start to get into things like data. There is a lot of conversation around data and research and things that maybe are a little bit more back end or maybe not quite so visible as things like mixed reality experiences. Not that there's anything wrong with mixed reality experiences, but the idea is of this transformation framework is that there is a lot of opportunity here. It can really help you further your mission, and you're only just scratching the surface with connected experience. And as I said, we're seeing more of that in Europe. So that's a great setup for my first speaker, who I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with and inviting. So I'm going to stop presenting here. And let me welcome Stephen Weiber from the International Federation of Libraries Associations, otherwise known as IFLA. Hi, Stephen. How are you? Good afternoon in the Netherlands.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, well, it's so good to meet you in London earlier this year, and really, very interested in what you're seeing across libraries globally, but also particularly in Europe for this conversation. Maybe we could start with, what sort of not necessarily related to COVID. We'll get into that because we can't have a conversation these days in 2020 without a conversation around COVID. But just generally, what are you seeing in libraries in Europe compared to the rest of the world?
So,
sort of trends.
Thank you for the question. I think what's probably a good place to start with is just to get a sense of how the European library field compares with that globally, just so you can compare in this way. We recently started a couple of years ago a project called Library Map of the World, which brings together library data, and it's making it possible to gain some insight. So, for example, we can see that Europe has a uniquely strong network of public libraries. There's an average of 14.6 public libraries per 100,000 people. So if my maths is right, that's about 1 for every 6,000 people in Europe. And that compares to a global average of less than 7, and an average in North America of only 5.7. So we have a really dense network. This comes to about, just looking in terms of density, there's about 1 library for every 58 square kilometers. That compares to 1 for every 254 globally, and even more actually in the US. I had the figure written down now. And in the US are even considerably more than that. What is interesting though is that in general European libraries tend to be smaller. So we have more, but they tend to be less well staffed. So, for example, there's almost 30 public librarians per 100,000 people in Europe, compared to 11.8 globally, but almost 40 in North America. And if you look around the world at the average number of staff per library, only 1 in the top 10 countries is actually European. So effectively, we have this dense network, but with a lot of smaller libraries, which may not have the sort of all the people, all the resources to actually do the same things as the big star libraries that there are. So I think we have that. I think, and then just following on from one of the things you said in the introduction, you're right that there's a strong link to culture. Libraries in Europe are fascinating because there is really the sense of being somewhere between education and culture and research. So there's this really cross-cutting function, and we're beginning to see that in some of the partnerships that are starting to form, in some of the sense that it is a social institution, it's part of the social infrastructure, as well as the educational, the research, the cultural infrastructure. So we're seeing all this happening. I suppose, and the final thing I'll say before we obviously get onto COVID, as we have to, one of the interesting things in Europe is it tends to be a continent where we have strong path dependencies in the way that things are organized. The public sector is strong, the public sector is regulated. And so there's often a sense that the library has to have its place within that public sector. And this can offer a certain degree of certainty. Certainly, we haven't seen the same sorts of job losses in European libraries that we've already seen in some of our American counterparts. At the same time, it does make libraries more dependent on the health of the public sector. It also can raise additional questions in how libraries can form partnerships and actually really realize their potential. And we're seeing it happening in some places, but I think this is an area where we're going to need to focus, not just in terms of building energy, but also in terms of building partnerships and showing how these partnerships are possible.
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting things there I'd love to dig into. One is this idea of just the difference in the number of libraries. Maybe it's what we said, the culture and education is culture is more, part of society. But also, I think, there's differences within Europe. I know in our conversation when we were talking before, I mentioned about, how I'm really noticing that The Czech Republic, for example, really has, significant investment in libraries, and you gave me a great insight to that. So maybe you'd love to share that, because I just found it fascinating. Yeah.
Indeed. So it's what's really fascinating there is that, as I said, the average number of libraries per 100,000 in Europe is 14.6. In the Czech Republic, it's nearly 60.
Yeah, that's amazing.
You can even look at, we've done the sums looking at the number of square kilometers served per library. The Czech Republic is comparable with Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Which is crazy when you think that this is basically.
It really is. Yeah.
And you have
so there must be something about why I mean, I understand what you're saying, that maybe the staff are less and that, but there must be something there around why that is. And I think you were also saying to me, that it's driving overall greater literacy, and love you to comment on that.
Absolutely. So I think part of the idea with libraries, I think, is that there is this sense of they're a public service, and that it is part of the government often. And this is probably more of a French idea, and indeed there was a report that came out of the French government a couple of years ago on this. It's sort of comforting to know that there is a public service available for many Europeans, that you have something that's actually there in the village. I think what we see in the Czech Republic, but also in a lot of former Soviet countries, former communist countries, is you have this very dense network that is there. They are markedly more numerous than in Western Europe, although Western Europe as well has good high numbers, higher than in North America. The positive thing about this, and again, we've done the research on this, we do tend to see that where you have more libraries, but also in particular where you have more librarians, people who are able to help out, you do tend to have fewer adults with lower skills. You tend to see smaller gaps in literacy. You tend to see smaller digital divides in particular. And so there does seem to be this correlation that's there. Clearly, of course, it's always going to be the case, well, how do you use this network? You have this potential, but how do you make full use of people that are there, not only to help people gain skills offline and online, but then realize it?
Yes. So, digital skilling is something that we're seeing, and as a big trend coming out of COVID, and not to, as I said, we can't have any conversation these days without COVID. It's hard to imagine what life was like before. But I think, we're seeing a lot of people displaced, and the libraries taking that role. Not the only people, but, clearly as an important part, libraries being part of community, and fulfilling that sort of digital divide. I think it's so interesting, because I'm a real data person. I just think it's so interesting of the wideness, I guess, I don't know if that's a real word, is it? The width of differences in terms of, libraries per capita. I just think that is so fascinating, and reflects potentially different outcomes that I think are worth looking at in sort of more detail for organizations. And I don't know how we influence other parts of the world to invest more in libraries and culture generally, but clearly it's, it has outcomes. Can you speak to another comment that you made there was around partnerships? Can you speak to a little bit more about what you mean by partnerships in this space? And
so I think, and actually the answer here will follow on from your previous one. Now, I think libraries often, like teachers, like social workers, there's always a tendency to move towards trying to see the library as delivering everything. So there has certainly been a move within Europe, within the US, elsewhere, to say that, well, libraries used to be about books and giving book recommendations and so on, but the potential of this community space, the potential of the resources is there, in particular the potential of getting online, means that you can go further. Of course, it's not reasonable to expect someone who's received a library degree to act as if they also have a teaching qualification and a social work degree, and they can also fix your iDevice or whatever. It's not reasonable to expect that, but what you can do is build up these partnerships. And this sort of sense of libraries moving in the direction of not just being providers of services, but also partners with others, platforms for others, portals to others. It's great. All these words begin with a P. It's fantastic. But the potential of libraries to actually work with other government ministries as part of more integrated approaches to public service delivery as this sort of entry point to various services, benefits, training, employment support, business information, the potential to work with other with civil society partners on training in order to, why don't bring the local coding club into the library, the local trainers, but also obviously working with business. There's certainly nothing necessarily against this in terms of actually allowing libraries to bring what they can to the table, and then combine it with what others can bring. Of course, the COVID point here, and this is going to be one of the questions, is how can you run this platform functionality in a digital world, and in particular in Europe, where you have a higher share of smaller libraries, which may not have the possibility to run a great big project. How can you run the same sort of really helpful community-focused partnerships and platform activities with only one library staff member, or even from a volunteer library, that you can in a much bigger one still make it relevant and effective in the time of COVID?
Yes, I think we've seen that elsewhere, where it really requires there to be like some larger sort of like library, so not association, but library at the national level, at the state, regional level, to sort of organize a number of libraries. Because you're right, each individual library has enough to do, and they're expanding their scope every day. And as I've said in previous webinars, librarians are lovely people. They're very community focused. I've seen some amazing stories of, around the world of what librarians have done under COVID, and but they can't do everything. And as you said, they're not trained in everything as well. So I actually wondered about that point. So I love that idea of partnerships, and but it's like, how best can we organize those? So maybe in our last few minutes, let's talk about COVID. What have you seen as sort of like the impact of COVID? I have seen amazing stories of people, driving books to communities, calling everybody in the community, curbside, what we call in the United States curbside pickup, but what do we call it in Europe? We used to call it footpath in Australia. But what else are you seeing out of COVID in coming out of libraries? What do you think will change and persist?
So one thing we've seen in particular in libraries in Europe is a real effort to move services online. In some cases, this has required a real effort to actually develop a digital presence that may not have existed so much. So, for example, in Portugal, previously there wasn't a digital presence for libraries, and actually over the space of a week, they developed one because it was realized that this was going to be necessary. And this has happened with all the preparations for summer reading challenges have been put online. There have been Ask a Librarian services set up on WhatsApp at the national level in Denmark. I think all of the examples that you set out, and a whole load of other inventiveness in terms of just how do you reach out to people, especially those who are most vulnerable, especially those who might not other be able to access, have been taking place. I think one of the big tendencies we're obviously seeing is a big rise in interest in library digital services, in when you actually access the ebooks, the other e-resources. And we're coming up against the fact that sometimes there's only so many digital resources available, and whereas it's relatively easier in an English or a French or even a German language environment to be able to access large banks of digital material at a price and under conditions that work for libraries, this isn't the case everywhere. And often this is partly just because the local providers, the local publishing industry is also relatively small and so can't afford to produce anything in that way. I think as we go forwards, we're likely to see a continued mixture of hybrid and virtual. We're going to have to see how this plays out for library budgets, whether the offer of digital materials grows and grows in a way that actually works for libraries and for users, as well, of course, for producers. I think that's going to be a big issue coming up. The other issue is always going to continue to be, how can we make sure that everyone is able to get online and use these services?
Yes.
There's always the 10% of people who don't want the internet or can't use the internet, and within the 90% who are connected, those who don't feel comfortable using it. How can you actually develop a way of helping there?
Yes, yeah, really interesting points. I never thought about the language issue. I think that maybe is out of being the privilege of being an English speaker. But yes, I can imagine that when you're not the dominant language, that clearly it shrinks the availability of content. And I know that we have auto translators and things these days, but it's not the same, right? There's nuance in language that that we're not yet quite there on technology. But it's getting better all the time. But still, it's and I can attest to that because you're back. As I said at the beginning, that I change cultures like every hour in my role. But I'm also often using Translate because original conversations happened in the native language of the country, and so it's I've experienced this firsthand. It's been a good experience for me. Thanks so much, Stephen. This has been really insightful. I am so fascinated. I just said I'm a data person. I'm so fascinated at some of those differences. Thank you for your time. We're going to have you back for Q&A after we've talked to Mark, and I really look forward to sort of joining you now. If people have questions for Q&A, please feel free to pop those in the chat, and we'll get those together. So now I'd love to introduce Mark East, my colleague at Microsoft. So welcome, Mark. Good to see you.
Hello, Catherine. Nice to be here.
Yes, and Mark is in Dubai at the moment. So as I said, we have a truly international sort of focus today, as we always do. So Mark, love to talk to you, based on your extensive experience in education over the course of your career and specifically at Microsoft. I think you've had this amazing, as I said at the beginning, amazing insight into both how education has grown, has changed over the years, but also how technology has changed over the years because, similarly, I haven't been working at Microsoft, but I've been in technology since the mid-'80s. And so, it's like night and day. But really interested in what sort of trends you're sort of seeing in, schools and universities across Europe, given that's your scope. And also you have a broader vision of what's happening in the world as well.
Yeah, well, thanks, Catherine. Well, first of all, I'm using Teams background effects, which is why it doesn't look like it's nighttime here in Dubai. In fact, it is nighttime. This is just a picture of my office in the UK taken during the daytime. So that's some of the great benefits of Teams and how you can use it. So I really am pleased to be on here. I talk about some of the trends. Everything is really COVID related, unfortunately, like like Stephen was talking about. I mean, when we started to see the first stages of COVID in December, having been to China about 3 or 4 times before, I knew that they wouldn't contain it. And one of the big challenges that I was concerned about was the contagion levels. So I was beginning to think it was a problem. And I remember when we had our own leadership meetings, in fact, I was in Seattle in February, I raised it as an agenda item because I was concerned about it. And I think all of us then started to realize that everything we did had to be focused on supporting schools and universities to get ready. And it was a good job we did focus on that because sure enough, in March, it moved from China. I think the first country in Europe that really was hit the hardest was Italy, and it quickly spread from there on throughout Europe. Now, what happened then was there was suddenly a realization by governments that maybe this isn't a temporary school closure. So they couldn't just give an extra couple of weeks off. They had to start thinking about how they could maintain the learning experience. And so there was a big focus straight away from governments on what we actually call stimulus. So governments all around Europe started to invest funding in technology. And I'm talking about here very large device orders of 1 million plus devices in many, many different countries around Europe as all of their schools closed. Yeah. Now, there's a knock-on effect of that right now because we're still seeing these governments continue to buy lots and lots of devices. And a lot of the manufacturers are now quoting 2 months supply on any orders. So anyone wanting to buy technology devices now are probably going to have a long wait. So my advice is order early and expect there to be delays before it all arrives. So that's what's happening. Everyone is using in schools and universities various connection tools. We're using Teams here. Of course, there are others on the market, but a lot of universities for sure are all using Teams right now to attend lectures. Certainly some of the trends that you would ask yourself, well, is this just a temporary phase? When we eventually get a vaccine for COVID, and hopefully we will, and everyone then gets vaccinated and we can overcome this disease, what happens then? And there's a hope and a realization that as teachers and lecturers in universities have been using this technology, they suddenly have been forced into this immersive, high immersive world of using IT. And suddenly then they would realize, wow, this is amazing technology. Well, we should be using this continuously. Let's see how that goes. I think it's certainly been, I feel sorry for teachers because they've not only had the risk of being infected themselves with inside schools, but then having to focus on how they build content for their students using this new technology where they perhaps haven't been focused on it before. So that level of training of pedagogy, how you actually use the technology to teach and for students to learn, I think they've been going through that now, and hopefully a lot of them have learned that this is a wonderful technology.
Yes.
We believe in the future that this concept of what we call flipped classrooms will become a reality. And the concept of flipped classrooms is where you go to a lesson to talk about a topic, having already watched the lesson. So teachers will record a lesson, use video, use rich media. The students will watch it, and then the next day perhaps come to the lesson and talk about it. So the experience of teaching is different. And the concept of teachers' roles changing to be more guides to independent, maybe self-paced learning, because you have different abilities within a class, will actually become a reality. It will mean a phenomenal change in assessment. Everything will change going forward. Yeah. That's what a lot of us in the technology industry will hope for. Because when you think about it, technology probably is the single most important use of its uses in education. And yet we're an industry which has been lagging behind, all the other industries have adopted technology. You still have a teacher standing up in front of the class with the desks and the students are listening intently, taking notes. And that's the standard pedagogy right now. But imagine a world where students can work in their peer groups, outside of the school building, develop courseware and work themselves, and then you start using the teachers more of a coaching guide. I think that the learning outcomes will be far, far better. We've also seen in higher education, by the way, where they have been using a lot of Teams, is that the students are now saying, I really would love to watch that lecture, but I want to watch it much more quickly. And we've been doing research now that shows that we can strip out all of the pauses in a lecture. So that a student can actually watch a lecture and actually use only 50% of the time that they would typically use. And so the students are loving that concept of how they can start using technology in that way. Yeah. I think the other major trend that we're seeing is the adoption of cloud, because many institutions are saying, well, we're buying more devices and we have to flip the way we're doing our investments. All of these huge data centers that we've got, we don't really need to have them anymore. We could just use public cloud, and it's far more cost effective doing it that way than before. And I think there's an interesting link perhaps with libraries on this respect, because I know that in the National Bibliothèque de Paris, they store 9 petabytes of data. If you can imagine how big that is, it's huge. They take a copy of the internet every single day, and they have these huge data centers which they're managing. And we're talking to them right now about possibly that they should be moving to a cloud solution, which will be much more cost effective. And one of the big concerns they have is how much time it would take for them to move those 9 petabytes of data to the cloud.
Yeah, a long time.
Luckily, we have some technology solutions for that. So that's an interesting one. And I think, the vision of libraries actually, for example, the library in Alexandria, they also take copies of the internet every single day, just like the Bibliothèque de Paris. But also they have a remit there of actually trying to preserve most of the Arabic books. So they have a lot of old books there. Some of them are disintegrating, and they're trying to digitize that content and recreate it. And of course, they're storing all of that for future generations to be able to access that sort of knowledge. I think the vision for libraries going forward for me is real community centres starting to change their old role. I mean, I must admit, I haven't been in a library from a personal use. I've been there for obviously working with Microsoft, but for personal uses since I was a child. And I'm thinking, well, once I had to go there because I had to get an internet connection because I was stranded and I couldn't get anywhere. But the internet connection was pretty poor in this particular library I went to. So imagine if you had really good broadband connection in libraries, and it's needed because of the digital divide. Even in the US right now, 1 in every 6 children do not have internet connectivity. So you see them sitting outside Taco Bell trying to get connected to the internet. If we could have more libraries offering these community services where they could go, get connected, maybe some interesting Minecraft, gaming for the students to be able to work with each other. Because one of the big challenges is if you're working online, you never know who you're really playing with. Okay, so there's a security issue there.
Sure.
I think libraries could offer those types of services, maybe even reach out to the small business and startup community and offer, Surface Hub devices in a room where you could conduct your meetings with multiple different companies all around. And of course, this translation service, which we talked about earlier, because you can now, if it costs a bit of money, so it's not like a small business will be able to invest in it, or even individuals, but going to the library, you could have translation on the fly, even text to speech. It could be done that way. So this sort of like is my imagination, probably working overtime, but how libraries could change and evolve into be really connecting the communities, having the older members of the community and the younger ones coming back to libraries and staying with them. But the digital divide is something that I just said my final comments on this is the digital divide has really been exposed. In terms of this move for COVID, because of course lots of students don't have technology. And a lot of the stimulus that's been invested in has been focused on the on those members of the community. That's where those devices are going.
Yeah. So interesting. Such a lot to unpack there. Maybe, the key to all this that I'm sort of seeing in all of this, you mentioned the digital divide, is also, just as we said earlier, digital literacy. So how do we help this sector understand what are the, not just how to do things digitally, but also how to make decisions about technology? What's your sort of advice for that? And of course, Microsoft has some great skilling programs as we, particularly coming out of COVID here.
Yeah, well, let's say from an educator perspective, we have lots of curriculum and content available. We have an education center. Up on the education center, we provide pedagogy training, product training, how to do things. We have webinars for teachers all around the world can join it. We have digital literacy curriculum. We have over 20 hours of digital literacy curriculum, which is available to anybody, by the way, which has just been recently updated on our Microsoft Learn site. So anybody wanting to learn, and typically I know it's over 20 hours, but I would imagine that maybe an older generation member of the community would go to the library and perhaps sit there for a couple of hours and then come back and do each day and learn that way. But certainly we have a lot of content. We have Skype in the classroom, as you know, and Skype in the classroom enables teachers to work with each other, connect with each other. You can use it. I know that they use it in the Natural History Museum in London because they organise where schools can connect to the museum, and then they hold special features where they might be talking about dinosaurs, for example, or something like that, to provide lessons and provide extra content for teachers that way. So we have a whole host of different content to help. The challenge is trying to direct people into the right way. And the only suggestion I can make to institutions is to contact their local Microsoft partner. We have them all around the world. They should be able to help them. Or go up to Microsoft.com and look for some of the webinars and things we're running to actually get that insight and understanding.
Yeah, there's an amazing amount of content out there. And the Microsoft Educator Center in particular has so much for educators. And we're definitely looking to, add stuff in there for libraries and museums as well. As we can, but really, even just generally for education, it's an amazing resource and gets amazing levels of traffic. But I think that's maybe one of the hidden secrets about Microsoft that people don't realize is just how much information we have, not just about our particular products, which are obviously very interesting, but also how to use them. We're very invested in usage, not just in acquiring things, and certainly for how that benefits society through libraries and museums.
Yeah.
I mentioned when we talked about Italy earlier that I saw a distinct response out of Italy, which was, as you might recall at the time, getting an amazing just devastating for the country with COVID. But their priority was in universities, and that was how to get museums to reach out to schools. And ultimately, we came up with a Skype in the Classroom solution for them. And for those who don't know what Skype in the Classroom is, it is the ability for you to be able to broadcast and reach into classes. So traditionally before COVID, it was with classrooms. After COVID, it is still classrooms, but those children are obviously distributed, but still come together as a class. It's been amazing how much museums have started to embrace this, and we're certainly looking to encourage more and more of that. But Italy was very much the lead in that space. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about this increasing sort of like connection between culture and education. Because I think people don't realize that museums are not just places you visit, but research institutions and educational institutions as well.
Yeah, well, Catherine, you're the expert on museums. So you probably know a little bit more about this than I do. So I'll
Sure.
talk to you. You know that I've explained to you that when I was a student, I wanted to be an archaeologist. So I have a great deal of interest in museums and connection. And I think that the reimagining of museums is an interesting thing. And if I was thinking to myself, if I was going there, I'll come on to the education particular topic, but I just wanted to share, if I was going into a museum right now, I want to know, if I'm going to a museum, I want them to know I was coming. So I want myself to be profiled. I'd want them to know if there was parking there, and if I could reserve a parking space, I would like to do that. So I'm not spending hours going around. If you tried parking near the Natural History Museum in London, you know what I mean by that.
Yes.
So that would be interesting. When I got there, I'd love there to be an application that say, oh, Marquise has arrived in the museum. I know he's interested in these sorts of things, so we make sure we guide him to wherever it is. I'd like using my mobile phone to be able to see a map and navigate to each of the exhibits that I want to go and see. I might like to know where I can get some refreshments at a certain time. I might not like to know, where I can go to the toilet, for example. Yeah. Because I've walked around museums for many hours trying to find things, and that's the big frustrating thing. You can get lost in museums, especially, places like the Louvre in Paris or even the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. So, those sorts of things would be useful. And then there are opportunities for museums. For example, if I was in the old Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and I was spending time looking at chariots, for example, I would then like them to think, hang on a second, this guy spent a long time on that exhibit. He must be really interested in chariots. And yet, in a month's time, we're going to bring out some more chariots. So let's let him know about that so he can come back and see all the other chariots that we've got there.
Yeah.
Or if I'm doing merchandising, to sell me even after I've left the museum that, there's books or things that I could buy that they could sell me afterwards. I think technology has something really to, really help museums. I mean, the Natural History Museum in London, they're looking at the digital twins technology because they're concerned about keeping their exhibits in an environment where it's not too hot, it's not too cold, it's in the Goldilocks zone. There's enough moisture, but not too much moisture. So there's huge technology solutions that we can provide to museums. Now, if you link it then to education, the fact that all of those exhibits can be online. So if I'm doing research for my degree, maybe it's anthropology, for example. My son's just gone to University College London to do anthropology. So, it's quite close by the Natural History Museum. He might want to access that information online, and they were closed like all of the other schools for a long period of time. So for him to get access to that digital information and engage with people, the researchers, for example, that are in the museums there, I think that would be phenomenal, that they could actually have that engagement. They could do Teams calls with each other. They can reach out, they can look for information on data, and even the students themselves can be adding value to the researchers and scientists in the museum. So I think there's just phenomenal opportunity going forward for museums embracing technology and for us to help connect students to the museums.
Yeah. Yeah. No, as I've often said, digital technology is has to do something that you can't do in the physical space. And I think if we look at it like that, as like, so for museums, it's giving more reach, it's giving more information. It's about, as you said, finding the restroom. When I was at the Natural History Museum in New York, that was actually, because we have analytics on it, it was actually the number one thing on our app was how to get to the ladies' room, which, is hard for museums to accept, but it's true. And it's part of, we used to talk about it as being part of the entire experience. So what you talk about here is, the entire experience, not just the exhibits, but also the, getting coffee or tea or afternoon tea and parking and all of those kinds of things.
It's not just the experience actually while you're there, it's the experience before and after. And I think There's a huge opportunity for that.
Well, we are that was an amazing conversation. So thank you so much, Mark. Love to keep talking about this topic, but we're going to run out of time. Let me bring Stephen back, and we'll just sort of do quick Q&A before we wrap up. We just have a few minutes for that. So Stephen, we may not have any questions, but the thing that I want to sort of bring up for both of you is the trend, the thing that I heard most and the thing that I'm hearing consistently is around the digital divide. And I think that, this is actually as much a Europe issue as it is as a global issue. So I'm definitely hearing about that in education. This idea about moving to one-to-one devices. I'm hearing about the role of libraries. This is a real big issue for society that I think we had not necessarily sort of thought about before. So love to sort of look at what do you suggest as, what are your suggestions for the best way to approach this issue for society?
So I guess on the library side, as you say, that there's always going to be the challenge. It's been extremely painful for libraries which know that the internet access that they've been providing has been essential, to be forced not to provide it. And even the example that Mark gave earlier of teenagers sitting outside the Taco Bell, obviously it's great when it's the summer, but also it's not as if European libraries always have the same sort of size car park or parking lot outside where you can sit with your car. And so a lot of the time it's difficult because some of those solutions that work in the US just don't work in Europe because we build differently. Yep. In terms of solutions that are out there, there's some really interesting work, and I know that, for example, through Microsoft Airband initiative, there's some fascinating potential there to use TV white space to reach out from libraries and provide people with better access. I think the scope of libraries to actually be places that lend out those Wi-Fi hotspots, that lend out devices to people who need them. And so, for example, we've seen I'm trying to remember which country it is, it's within Europe, where libraries have been lending out laptops to people who need them for e-health purposes. A lot of libraries have actually been the one thing that they have opened. We've seen this in Sweden, where libraries have closed in some situations. The one thing they leave open is the computer access. So there are ways of just sort of extending, flexing at the margins in terms of making sure that people do have access to these devices, that there is sort of stronger Wi-Fi so that people aren't having to rely on their data packages in order to get online.
Yes.
I think what we will need to see, and I think fortunately we have seen this in a few cases, and Mark mentioned that there has been a lot of spend on devices. We probably do need to move to a situation where we are trying to make sure that anyone who doesn't have access to a device now just does. And that libraries within their communities can be a way of actually running that. In parallel, and very quickly, again, it's always going to be a chicken and egg question. How do you provide digital skills to someone who isn't confident in using a computer? And so actually innovation in that, really thinking about how can you help the person who's scared of the computer use a computer to learn about computers is going to be an ongoing challenge. And we're seeing some interesting innovation already, but that could certainly be rolled out further.
No, I think, this is we're seeing it everywhere, about education, about just general society, access to the internet, access to technology, not the access to skills is not the luxury it used to be. It's now sort of like, table stakes. And I don't think we have all the answers, but how do we get there? Any sort of comments from you, Mark, on that?
Well, it's not just all about just the devices and the connectivity. Broadband is the electricity of the 21st century, so it really is an important thing to get fixed. But there are other things as well, such as accessibility. There are 1 billion people on the planet that have either part-time or long-term issues of handicap. So all the technology has to be built, and I'm really proud of the way that Microsoft has a special unit that focuses on this, and no new products are actually released until they've checked them for accessibility. So I'm proud about that, and I think we are trying to breach that divide. But there's also a divide about the use of technology by women. It's interesting that 58% of men in the world have access to technology, but only 48% of women do.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
And that's culturally, in a lot of that's in countries where they believe the wife shouldn't need to be, the female shouldn't be using the technology. They've got their own things to do in the household. But of course, that's wasted opportunity.
Absolutely.
But the overall solution, I think, is governments, because I've looked at all of the different aspects of this. I mean, for example, donors, they need to be coordinated. In some cases, they're duplicating. If you're talking about medium and low-income countries, they're duplicating projects rather. They could be coming together so that we can, apply the right type of solution overall. And governments have to bring all that together. And the TV white space comment that Stephen made, it's really governments that have to give a license for that, and then they have to work with the telcos to make sure that access is affordable. And it's a great solution, TV white spaces, but there has to be an overall government coordination to make it all work, I believe.
Yeah, great. Well, with that, I think we're almost at time. Really, thank you so much to both of you for some really interesting insights here. So thank you. And it's amazing how much Dubai looks like UK. Thank you both. So just before we wrap up, just want to remind people that we have an amazing community on LinkedIn for libraries and museums. So libraries and museums professionals. It's called the Microsoft Libraries and Museums LinkedIn community. If you can't find it, ping me on LinkedIn. And but anyway, if you just search for it, you'll find it. We have 815 members as of this morning, globally around the world in that group. It's a great way to find out, how to access these kinds of topics that we're talking about. Also, obviously, to keep track of, the next webinars, the topics, and things like that. So, thank you everyone for joining, and I will hand it back to Heather. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. As a reminder, you can access the event recording at the same location you used to join today's event. Lastly, your feedback is important. Please take a few minutes to let us know how we did by completing a short survey that will appear in your browser window shortly after the stream ends. I'd like to extend a final thank you to our presenters. This concludes today's event. You may now disconnect.